Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Gossips 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up.
Hope Logan never imagined that a wedding, something she once believed was sacred, healing and redemptive, could become the stage for the most devastating revelation of her life. But on the morning she was supposed to marry Liam Spencer, everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and truth came crashing down in a way that felt almost cruelly poetic, because it wasn't a screaming argument or a dramatic slap that stopped the ceremony cold. It was a piece of paper, a quiet, damning document Liam never meant for her to see, a secret will drafted in the darkest hours of his life when he believed he was dying, when fear made decisions in his place and honesty became optional. And as Hope stood in the bridal suite surrounded by soft white fabric and flowers meant to symbolize new beginnings, the words on that page burned through her like fire, each sentence revealing a version of Liam she didn't recognize anymore, a man who had prepared for his own death without ever preparing her for the truth, a man who had made decisions about their future while deliberately shutting her out. And as the reality sank in, Hope felt something shift deep inside her. Not heartbreak exactly, but clarity. Because the will didn't just outline financial arrangements or guardianship plans, it revealed priorities, fears, and emotional loyalties that contradicted every promise Liam had made to her in the months leading up to the wedding. And suddenly all those moments where he seemed distant, distracted, or overly intense made sense, because Liam had been living with one foot in the grave and one foot at the altar, and instead of trusting Hope with that truth, he had chosen silence, believing he was protecting her when in reality he was stripping her of the right to decide whether she could walk beside him through that fear. And when Hope confronted him, her voice steady but her hands shaking, the air between them grew heavy with unsaid words, because Liam's guilt poured out. In fragments, apologies tangled with justifications, claims of love wrapped in fear, and as he explained how he didn't want to burden her, didn't want to scare her away, didn't want to see pity in her eyes, Hope realized that this wasn't just about a will or a secret, it was about trust, and for someone who had built her entire identity on honesty, integrity, and emotional transparency, the realization that her future husband had made life-altering decisions without her knowledge felt like betrayal disguised as protection. And as the tension spread through the house and word reached Brooke, Steffi, Ridge, and even Bill, who read the will with a mixture of pride, regret, and a haunting sense of déjà vu, the ripple effects grew stronger, because Bill saw himself reflected in Liam's choices, the same instinct to control outcomes rather than share vulnerability, while Steffi couldn't help but wonder whether this secret revealed that Liam was still emotionally divided, still tethered to past fears and unresolved attachments. And as the guests waited, unaware that the ceremony was unraveling from the inside out, Hope made a decision that stunned everyone, a decision that wasn't fueled by anger or revenge but by self-respect, because she stepped out into the hallway, met Liam's eyes, and calmly announced that the wedding was postponed, not cancelled, not destroyed, but paused, because she needed time to understand the man she was about to marry, and whether he was truly capable of walking beside her as an equal. And that quiet declaration landed harder than any outburst could have, leaving Liam visibly shaken as he realized that love wasn't enough to carry them forward without truth. And as Hope removed her engagement ring, not with finality but with intention, she explained that marriage wasn't about grand gestures or secret sacrifices, it was about choosing each other openly, even when the truth was terrifying. And as she walked away, the room filled with a heavy silence that forced everyone present to confront their own histories of secrecy and emotional avoidance, because Hope's decision wasn't just about Liam, it was a mirror held up to every relationship in that room, exposing the cost of silence and the fragile line between protection and control. And as Liam stood alone, clutching the will that had been meant as an act of love but had instead become a symbol of mistrust, he finally understood that his greatest mistake wasn't preparing for death, it was failing to let Hope be part of his life when it mattered most. And as the wedding guests slowly dispersed and whispers spread through Los Angeles about the postponed ceremony, Hope drove away not knowing what the future held but certain of one thing. She would never again say "I do" without knowing the full truth, even if that truth meant facing uncertainty alone, because sometimes the bravest decision isn't walking down the aisle, it's having the courage to stop when your heart tells you something isn't right. And in that moment, Hope Logan didn't just postpone a wedding. She reclaimed her voice, her power, and her right to choose a love built on honesty, no matter the cost. After Hope walked away from the Forrester estate that day, leaving behind silk ribbons, confused guests, and a groom who looked like the ground had vanished beneath his feet, the shockwaves of her decision didn't fade. They deepened, settling into every relationship connected to Liam like a slow, relentless pressure, because postponing the wedding wasn't a clean break, it was an open wound, and Liam felt it in every quiet moment that followed, every unanswered text, every night he lay awake, replaying Hope's expression when she realized how completely he had failed to trust her. And for the first time in his life, Liam Spencer was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that love alone had never been his problem. Fear was fear of loss, fear of pain, fear of being seen at his weakest. And that fear had shaped his choices far more than he ever wanted to admit, because as days passed and Hope withdrew into her work, channeling her turmoil into hope for the future with a laser focus that alarmed even her closest allies, Liam found himself spiraling, torn between the urge to fight for her and the paralyzing realization that he no longer knew how to reach her without crossing the very boundary she had drawn. And while Brooke tried to remain neutral, reminding Hope that postponement wasn't the same as walking away, even she couldn't ignore the steel in her daughter's resolve, because Hope wasn't punishing Liam, she was protecting herself, and that distinction mattered. Especially as old patterns threatened to resurface, patterns that had already cost her so much happiness in the past, and meanwhile, Bill Spencer couldn't shake the gnawing guilt that crept in every time he thought about Liam's will, because the language, the contingency planning, the emotional distance embedded in those pages were unmistakably familiar, and Bill saw with painful clarity how his own legacy of emotional armor had shaped his son, teaching him that strength meant control and that vulnerability was something to be managed rather than shared. And when Bill finally confronted Liam, the conversation wasn't explosive. It was devastating in its quiet honesty, because Bill admitted that he had done the same thing more times than he could count, making decisions for the people he loved instead of with them, convincing himself it was protection when it was really fear dressed up as power, and that admission cracked something open in Liam, who realized that breaking this cycle would require more than apologies, it would require a complete rewiring of how he approached love. And as that realization settled in, another complication emerged, one that Hope couldn't ignore no matter how hard she tried, because Steffi, despite her own complicated history with Liam, wasn't gloating or waiting in the wings, she was watching closely, aware that unresolved emotional fractures had a way of pulling people back into familiar chaos. And when Steffi reached out to Hope, not as a rival but as someone who had once stood where she now stood, the conversation was tense but honest, filled with unspoken history and shared understanding, and Steffi warned her that Liam's instinct to shut down when afraid had nearly destroyed all of them before, and that if Hope chose to move forward without addressing that truth head-on, she risked repeating the same painful cycle. And Hope listened, not defensively but thoughtfully, because deep down she knew this wasn't just about one secret. It was about whether Liam was capable of evolving beyond the man he had always been when pressure mounted. And as the days turned into weeks, the postponed wedding became the unspoken topic everyone danced around, a ghost haunting every family dinner and boardroom meeting, because no one knew whether Hope's decision was a pause or the beginning of an ending, and Liam, desperate to prove he had changed, began stripping away the emotional armor piece by piece, seeking therapy, confronting long-buried fears, and finally acknowledging the truth he had avoided for so long, that he had equated honesty with burden and vulnerability with weakness. And as he began to do the hard work of untangling those beliefs, Hope watched from a distance, torn between hope and self-preservation, because while part of her wanted to believe that growth was possible, another part of her refused to ignore how deeply the betrayal had cut. And then came the moment that shifted everything again, the moment that reminded them all that secrets never exist in isolation, because new information surfaced about the circumstances under which Liam had written the will, details that suggested he had been facing more than fear, more than a hypothetical illness, and as questions arose about what he had truly been dealing with at the time, questions he had never fully answered, Hope realized that postponing the wedding had been the right decision, because the truth was still unfolding, still incomplete, and she wasn't willing to bind her future to someone whose past was still shrouded in silence. And when she finally confronted Liam again, the conversation wasn't about blame, it was about boundaries, about whether he could stand in the discomfort of full transparency without retreating into old habits. And as he looked at her, truly looked at her, Liam understood that winning Hope back wouldn't come from grand declarations or promises of change, but from consistent, uncomfortable honesty, the kind that left no room for interpretation or control, and as the future remained uncertain, one thing became painfully clear to everyone involved. Hope's stunning decision hadn't just postponed a wedding, it had forced a reckoning, exposing the fault lines beneath every relationship built on half-truths and good intentions, and whether or not Hope and Liam would ultimately find their way back to each other. The story moving forward would no longer be about avoiding pain, but about choosing truth, even when it threatened to unravel everything they thought they wanted. Because in the world of the bold and the beautiful, love doesn't survive on secrets. It survives on the courage to face them. As the truth continued to peel back layer by layer, Hope found herself standing at a strange emotional intersection where love, disappointment, and self-awareness collided, because postponing the wedding had given her space, but it hadn't brought peace. And every morning she woke up knowing that the life she thought she was stepping into no longer existed in the same shape. And while she poured herself into work and motherhood, there was an undercurrent of unresolved emotion that refused to stay buried, especially as whispers began circulating that Liam's will hadn't been written during a vague emotional crisis, but during a very real medical scare that he had intentionally minimized when speaking to everyone in his life, including Hope. And when that information reached Brooke, her protective instincts flared instantly, because this wasn't just about dishonesty anymore. It was about omission that could have altered every decision Hope made in the last year. And when Brooke confronted Liam with a mother's fury barely masked by composure, demanding to know why her daughter had been left in the dark about something so serious, Liam didn't deflect or justify himself the way he once might have, instead admitting that fear had convinced him he could handle it alone, that if the worst happened, the will would take care of the mess without forcing Hope to live in terror alongside him. And hearing that explanation only hardened Hope's resolve, because while she understood fear, she refused to accept the idea that love meant isolation during moments of vulnerability. And as she listened to Liam speak, she realized that this was the fundamental difference between them. Hope believed in shared burdens, in walking through darkness together, while Liam had been conditioned to believe that strength meant shielding the people you love from pain, even if it meant lying by omission. And that realization pushed Hope toward a decision she hadn't anticipated making so soon. Because instead of waiting passively to see if Liam would change, she began actively redefining what she wanted her future to look like, independent of him. And that shift didn't go unnoticed, especially by Thomas, who watched quietly as Hope reclaimed her autonomy with a calm confidence that felt both familiar and distant. And while Thomas kept his distance, aware of the complicated history between them, his presence alone stirred something in Liam, a jealousy mixed with panic that he struggled to keep in check because for the first time, Liam truly believed he could lose Hope not to another man, but to herself, and that possibility terrified him more than any medical diagnosis ever had. And as tensions rose, another confrontation became inevitable, one that neither Hope nor Liam could avoid, because unresolved truths have a way of demanding attention. And when Hope finally sat Liam down again, away from family pressure and lingering expectations, she laid everything out, with brutal honesty, explaining that postponing the wedding wasn't a test or a punishment, it was a boundary, one she would not move until she was absolutely certain that Liam was capable of full transparency, not just when it was convenient or dramatic, but in the quiet moments where fear tempted him to retreat. And as she spoke, Liam realized that the woman sitting across from him was no longer willing to negotiate her values for the sake of comfort or tradition, and that realization forced him into a reckoning of his own, because loving Hope meant unlearning everything he had been taught about control, masculinity, and sacrifice. And as he struggled to articulate his commitment to that change, outside forces continued to complicate matters, because Bill, haunted by the parallels between his past and Liam's present, took it upon himself to intervene once again, this time not as a fixer, but as a cautionary tale, openly admitting to Hope that he had spent years confusing dominance with devotion, and that if Liam didn't confront that pattern now, it would haunt him for the rest of his life. And hearing Bill speak with such raw self-awareness struck Hope deeply, because it confirmed what she already suspected, that this wasn't just Liam's issue, it was generational, and breaking that cycle would require more than love, it would require accountability. And as the emotional stakes intensified, the postponed wedding continued to cast a long shadow, because friends and family began to realize that this wasn't a delay leading back to the altar, it was a transformation that could just as easily lead Hope away from it entirely. And when Hope finally admitted, to herself more than anyone, that she no longer knew if marriage to Liam aligned with the woman she was becoming. The truth hit her with equal parts grief and relief, because letting go of the future she had planned didn't mean abandoning love, it meant honoring her growth. And as Liam stood on the other side of that realization, watching Hope evolve beyond the role he had unconsciously cast her in, he understood that winning her back wouldn't be about convincing her to stay, it would be about becoming someone worthy of walking beside her without secrets, without control, and without fear dictating his choices. And as the days stretched on with no clear resolution in sight, one thing became undeniable. The postponed wedding had ignited a chain reaction that could not be undone, forcing every person involved to confront uncomfortable truths about love, honesty, and the cost of silence, and whether Hope and Liam would ultimately find their way back to each other or walk separate paths entirely. The decision ahead would no longer be made out of habit, guilt, or fear, but out of clarity, because Hope Logan had reached a point where she refused to settle for a love that asked her to compromise her voice, and that choice, more than any secret will or postponed ceremony, would change everything. Forever. As the weight of everything that had happened continued to settle, Hope began to realize that the postponement of the wedding had quietly altered the balance of her entire world. Because once you step off a path you believed was fixed, you start noticing all the other directions you were never brave enough to consider, and this awareness followed her everywhere, from the design floor at Forrester Creations to the quiet moments at home when the noise of expectations finally faded and she could hear her own thoughts clearly. And what unsettled her most wasn't anger toward Liam, but the unsettling calm that had taken its place, because calm meant clarity, and clarity meant she could no longer hide from the truth that part of her had been bending for years, shrinking herself to accommodate Liam's fears, his indecision, his habit of managing love instead of living it. And as this realization took hold, memories resurfaced with painful sharpness. Times when Liam had pulled away without explanation, moments when she had accepted half answers because pushing for more felt exhausting, and suddenly the secret will didn't feel like an isolated betrayal, but the final proof of a long-standing pattern she had been rationalizing away. And meanwhile Liam was unraveling in a different way, because for the first time he wasn't being chased by competing loyalties or dramatic ultimatums. He was facing a quiet distance that offered no roadmap back, and that absence terrified him because he couldn't fix it with apologies or declarations of love. And as he watched Hope grow more self-assured, more centered, more unwilling to compromise, he began to understand that his greatest fear wasn't losing her to another man, but losing the version of her who once waited for him to catch up. And this fear drove him to confront the one person he had avoided blaming all along, himself, forcing him to revisit the moment he wrote the will, the sterile room, the test results that hadn't been conclusive but had been frightening enough to convince him that control was the only way to survive. And in reliving that moment, Liam finally admitted what he had never said out loud, that a part of him had always believed he wasn't strong enough to be vulnerable, that if Hope saw how afraid he truly was, she might stop believing in him, and that belief, deeply ingrained and profoundly flawed, had shaped every choice he made afterward. And as this internal reckoning unfolded, outside forces continued to press in because Ridge, watching the situation spiral, couldn't help but draw parallels to his own past mistakes, recognizing too late how often silence had been his weapon of choice. And when Ridge finally sat Hope down, not as a father issuing advice but as a man acknowledging regret, his words carried unexpected weight, because he admitted that the moments he regretted most weren't the fights or the breakups, but the truths he withheld out of fear of confrontation, and hearing that from someone who had lived through decades of emotional chaos reinforced Hope's resolve, because she refused to build a marriage on the same foundation of avoidance and emotional compartmentalization that had fractured so many relationships before hers. And as the days turned into a fragile routine of separation and introspection, another revelation surfaced, one that shifted the narrative yet again, because documents connected to Liam's will revealed contingency clauses that extended far beyond what Hope had initially seen, clauses that suggested Liam had been preparing not just for death, but for the possibility of prolonged incapacity. And when Hope learned this, the ground shifted beneath her once more, because this meant Liam had envisioned a future where she was left managing the aftermath without ever being invited into the conversation beforehand, and that realization hurt in a way that words couldn't fully capture, because it wasn't just about fear anymore. It was about exclusion. And when Hope confronted Liam with this new information, the conversation that followed was raw, stripped of defensiveness, and filled with long silences where neither of them rushed to fill the space, and in that stillness, Liam finally said the words Hope had needed to hear. Not apologies, not promises, but acknowledgement, that he had taken away her agency, that he had decided what she could and couldn't handle, and that in doing so, he had failed her as a partner. And hearing that truth spoken aloud cracked something open in Hope, but it didn't erase the damage because accountability doesn't automatically restore trust.